Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. And on behalf of the Asian Bankers Association and Fintelekt, a very, very warm welcome to each and every one of you to this webinar on conducting an enterprise-wide AML CFT risk assessment. By way of introduction, my name is Shirish Pathak. I will be your host today. At the outset, let me thank the Asian Bankers Association for their ongoing support to make these webinars tremendously popular and well attended. For today's webinar, we have over 600 registrations from across 39 countries. As with the past Fintelekt ABA webinars, the recording of today's session will be available on Fintelekt Academy. If you wish to get a participation certificate for the session today, you may sign up for a subscription to Fintelekt Academy, a premium subscription at a low price of $125 per year, which is further discounted to an even lower special price for ABA members at $95 a year. This will allow you to earn certificates not just for this webinar, but also for future Fintelekt ABA webinars throughout the year. And it will also give you complete access to many, many more AML CFT related certificate courses that are available on Fintelekt Academy. Today we have two expert speakers, Madhu Sinha, former head of AML at Citibank India and now an independent AML consultant, and Stephen Cutler, Chief Enterprise Risk and Compliance Officer at Omnipay Philippines. The presentations today will be followed by a Q&A session with the audience, so feel free to post questions using the Q&A window on your screen. And I can see we already have two questions which have come in, so that's great. The length of today's webinar is around 45 minutes, and we will keep about 15 or 20 minutes for the Q&A, so hope to wrap up everything in about an hour. So why did we choose the topic, this topic for the webinar? As many of you know, regulators expect banks and financial institutions to undertake a holistic and organization-wide approach to management of AML CFT related risks. Not only is this important for the individual institution, but it is also very important collectively for a particular industry sector and country in the run-up to any national risk assessment exercise or preparing for a mutual evaluation. And at the very basic level, I think it is important for all of us as compliance professionals to understand and measure the risks faced by our institutions, because as the saying goes, if one cannot measure, one cannot manage. And today, while our expert speakers will take you through the fundamentals, they will also share insights based on their own practical experience on how to manage the AML CFT risk assessment process better. Let me say a few words about our first speaker, Madhu Sinha. So Madhu has worked in banking and finance for the last 34 years. She was the director and head of AML at Citibank for 5 years before her retirement. Before that, she served as the head of compliance at GE Capital India and also held senior level compliance positions in India's two leading banks, the State Bank of India and ICICI Bank. In her long career, Madhu has handled diverse facets of banking such as AML and regulatory compliance, retail banking, banking operations, international trade finance, non-resident Indian banking, and remittances. She also worked in Canada for about 4 years. Madhu, welcome to the webinar, and maybe have your presentation, please.
Yes, thank you, Shirish. I hope you're able to see me and hear me.
Yes, absolutely, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you so much. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone, all the participants from various countries. Shirish tells me that there are about 40 countries represented on this webinar, which is a huge honor for me. I'm really thankful to Fintelekt and ABA for giving me this opportunity to talk to all of you. So welcome, and let's start the topic right away. I will first set the agenda for this webinar first. So requesting, yes, you can see the agenda screen. And the agenda is to discuss the importance of ongoing AML CFT EWRAs, which we will be calling EWRAs, enterprise-wide risk assessments, ensure comprehensive inclusion of risks, regulatory expectation and national standards on EWRA, and how to manage costs and resources of EWRA. The next slide, please. Okay, so I'll start with why we should conduct AML CFT risk assessment. And while Shirish briefly mentioned this and talked about this, I will first like you to introduce to the well-agreed introduction and definition of enterprise-wide AML risk assessment. As most of the regulators across the world and across Asia will tell you that it actually assesses the financial institutions' inherent AML CFT risk, effectiveness of control environment, and the need to implement additional measures to mitigate residual risk where necessary. So essentially, AML EWRA has three components: the inherent risk, the control environment and effectiveness of it, and the residual risk based on which an additional measures to mitigate the same needs to be applied enterprise-wide. EWRA gives a financial institution an overview of their money laundering and terrorist finance risk exposure, and it also forms the foundation or the cornerstone of their AML program. It also enables them to apply controls in a risk-based manner, which is something that is recommended not only by FATF but by regulators across the world and in all countries. And of course, based on EWRA risk measurements, the enhancement of AML CFT policies, processes, and controls keeps getting reviewed and enhanced continuously. Most of all, an effective process of EWRA provides regulatory comfort on management of AML CFT risk. And it is no wonder, therefore, that since the time when AML became identified as a significant risk for all financial institutions, the regulators have come out with guidance to have a regular EWRA conducted by all financial institutions. They started with banks, but they have slowly asked all reporting entities to also get this assessment done at periodic intervals. In my country, RBI has come out with a timeline and a guidance to conduct EWRA for all banks and NBFCs. And I was looking at other countries' requirements as well, and I have seen at least MAS has come out with a detailed guidelines. Austrac has, I'm sure HKMA also has, and other countries will also, if not already there, they will also be slowly having these guidances issued by their regulators. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, the next slide is having talked about the importance of EWRA. The question is, how do we conduct the EWRA? Now, looking at the importance of this document or this process, which effectively lays the foundation of the AML program of NFI, it is important that we have a model which takes care of all the risk factors that need to be included in this exercise. And therefore, each financial institution will first need to develop a model which will be customized to the type and complexity of their business model. And essentially, it should take care of the three important components of risk assessment: the inherent risk, the control effectiveness, and the residual risk, and put all the data. For inherent risk, we need to look at the likelihood and impact of that particular AML risk for that particular business line, and then come out with a score like high, medium, and low risk. Then look at the effectiveness of existing controls, which can be rated as sufficient or fair or below average, and then give a rating to the residual AML risk, which can be high, medium, low, and depending on the risk tolerance of that particular FI or business, we have to look at what additional controls are required in order to mitigate that residual risk. And while doing so, what do we need to take care of? What are the risk factors that need to be taken care of? So it is customer types, which essentially mean how many high-risk customers do you have in your portfolio? Are there too many PEPs or other type of high-risk customers? What kind of products and services does the FI offer? Are they simple products, complex products? What are the geographies that they deal in? Are they present in various foreign geographies, or they have dealings with those high-risk geographies? What are the channels? Are there branch channels, non-face-to-face channels, digital channels, online channels? And what is the level of transactions, the value and volume and complexity of transactions that the FI deals with? Each one of them need to be risk rated, given a risk score to come out with a EWRA report. The third very important component of conducting an EWRA will be a qualitative and quantitative analysis of data that is present. So past data is important for evaluation of risk, which will include what type of customers are present, what type of transaction, what is the level of transaction monitoring, is it automated, non-automated, what is the level of suspicious transactions that have gone through, the cash, non-cash transactions. What has been the metrics that the senior management has been looking at. And apart from that, there'll be qualitative aspects on what is the nature of compliance culture that is present in the FI. What is the level of employee expertise? Have there been background checks of the employees? What kind of name screening requirements have we employed before hiring the employees? Is there adequate AML training given to them? All those come under the qualitative controls that are present. These needs to be evaluated, given a score, and then come to a residual risk rating. The fourth very important component of an EWRA would be documentation. So documenting whatever you do, what are the assumptions that you are taking, why and how has that decision been reached? Has the previous lesson learned from previous incidents, if any, of the AML and CFT nature been taken care of? And what has been the first, second, and third line of defense inputs that have come in during the period of review? Has that been taken into account? All these come under the qualitative review of data, and finally are fed into the EWRA. The fifth and very important aspect of EWRA would be to keep the senior management updated of the EWRA outcomes and required action, because every EWRA report will eventually have certain residual risk, which will require strengthening of controls. And depending on where you want to keep your risk tolerance in check, you have to keep the senior management informed of the level of risk they are dealing with, and take a call on whether or not the further enhancement of the controls is required. And accordingly, obviously, if you keep your senior management involved, you'll be able to set the tone from the top, and also an adequate resources and budgets will also follow from there. So it's important that the senior management of the FI remains in sync and very, very engaged with the process of EWRA. And that is what the regulators across the world also expect from an FI. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay. The next and a very important aspect of EWRA exercise is that it should be a living document. It cannot be a static document, which is a one-time calculation and then it remains there. It has to be, because risks of a business keep evolving, they keep changing. There are external factors which keep emerging. There are new typologies which will keep emerging. So so the EWRA of an FI should also accordingly be a living document and not a static document. It requires periodic review. It can be an annual or a semi-annual review, which is prescribed and as per the risk tolerant of the FI. It can also be a trigger-based or situation-based review that needs to be taken care of. For example, if you're introducing a new product, a new channel of delivery, or a new technology, which in your assessment is likely to impact the overall AML risk of that particular business line or of the enterprise as a whole, it requires a review of the AML risk assessment. Similarly, the controls that you have instituted to manage that risk will also need a review. So every time there is a substantive change happening in your products, channels, technology, the review of effectiveness of controls should also follow. And as we were talking in the previous slides, these all need to be documented. Identifying the trigger events for review is important. So there could be many triggers for review which require review of risk assessment, and a few of them I would just like to discuss with you are, like, for example, there's a big change in your customer base, right? Or with big change in your customer uptake of a particular product or channel, or there's a change in the volume or value of relevant transactions, or you make a change to the product or channel. It is a product is expanded with additional features, or your transaction monitoring picks up some trends in your AML scenarios and is thrown up as a potential risk. Or there is some advisory coming in from the regulators or law enforcement agencies who have, as an industry, picked up some new typology emerging in the AML environment of the country or of the bank, of the FI ecosystem. That all of that will be a reason for you to again review your EWRA and look at the effectiveness of your controls, and if necessary, enhance those controls, make the necessary changes in your processes, in your policies, and most important of all, escalate and update those changes with proper rationale to the senior management for them to take a call and remain engaged, because when regulators come calling, what they want is to always have the comfort that the senior management is engaged with each and every step of the risk assessment exercise. So net, the message is that you should not wait for the events to happen, but build a robust EWRA structure which will take care of any potential changes in the AML environment and keep you up, your AML program updated with that. Next slide, please. So this slide essentially talks about the desired outcome in the eyes of a country regulator. What should be the outcome of an EWRA process? And some of the outcomes that a regulator will necessarily look for in your EWRA is it should result in board oversight and accountabilities within senior management. So as we all know, one step is the setting the tone at the top, and second is putting the roles and responsibilities and accountabilities clearly is what makes any system or process efficient. So board oversight, the clear directions from them, and accountability within the senior management for each risk that gets assessed within each business line is important. We should then a sound and systematic framework and processes for RA for each business line. There should be an ongoing process which takes care of the assessment, review, and realignment of controls for that particular segment, and feeding the same into the future risk assessment, which is important. The regulators also look for, and I'm talking from looking at the various regulatory reports across Asia, they want an accurate qualitative and quantitative analysis of controls. And many a times they have found that this is not done. And it's only the analysis of qualitative and quantitative controls is on data is only done as a, on paper without proper understanding of that particular risk, which should be avoided. So the data, first of all, has to be accurate, and then the system and model should give you an accurate analysis of that data to be able to reach to a good residual risk. Then assess the effectiveness of control, and that should again be an ongoing process of review. Testing by compliance is important, which is the second line of defense, and also further testing by the audit in order that these controls remain effective and they are just not left to the business lines to evaluate. So testing and evaluation by second and third line of defense of these controls and validation by them is important. Then each EWRA will also throw up to you some areas of improvement, right? And the periodic review should take care of that areas of improvement, the lesson learned, the new guidance that comes from the regulators. Has there been a gap analysis of it? Have there been a gap identified? Have they been evaluated and then escalated to the senior management and then incorporated into the EWRA? All of this is something that a regulator will require and expect from the EWRA exercise. And of course, last but not the least, appropriate budgets and resources, because all of these things that we discussed will require budgets and resources. And by having a risk-based approach on the risk assessment and mitigation, we can, the EWRA gives us a very good picture of where to put that budget and those resources. So that's about the outcome of desired outcome of EWRA. Next slide. Some of the regulatory expectations further from AML EWRA is number one, and we have talked about this, is tone from the top, board oversight, and deliberation by senior management, which is very important. And this has been my experience as well in my tenure as compliance officer, that the regulator, when they come for scrutiny or inspections, they not only want an oversight by the board, they also look at how has the deliberation happened among the senior management on the risk identified by the EWRA or other risk assessment processes. So the deliberation and the documentation of that those deliberation, the actions taken, the tracking of those actions, all of that becomes very important in managing the EWRA process. The second aspect that regulators expect from you is to have a structured rating methodology, a rationale for proper weightages of different risk factors which constitute EWRA, for example, the product, the channels, the customer type. All of these have to be given a proper weightage in the ultimate risk analysis, and the rationale for the same should be documented as well. Adequate understanding of EWRA methodology by the concerned staff is another area which regulators want every FI to be thinking about and be at par with their expectation, because as we talked earlier, they have many a times found that this process is done in a mechanical way without proper understanding of the real risk factors. Accurate qualitative and quantitative analysis, which we already talked about. Good use of data analytics is important, because having this kind of exercise cannot be effective unless we have a good data analytics tools. Some banks already do have a very good matrix system, which are already in place, and they do the data analytics based on these metrics. Otherwise, the model that the FIs use should have data analytics tools incorporated into that, which throw up good reports on the analytics and and should ultimately feed into the risk assessment under the EWRA. Insightful assessment of control effectiveness is important. Each business line should be aware of the controls that it is putting in place for all the risks that it carries, and the EWRA papers or documentation should give a proper rationale for the controls that have been put. Are they manual? Are they automated? And the rationale for the same and future strategy for the same should be clearly spelled out in the EWRA. And last but not the least, each EWRA process and document should identify and address the areas of improvement, because AML risk can never be undervalued. There'll always be areas for improvement in the control mechanisms, and putting the controls on which are manual into an automated environment. So the strategies for the same should be clearly spelled out, agreed upon, approved, and then put into the EWRA process. As I said, various regulators have already come up with the guidance spelling out these expectations. And of course, it is following from the FATF, which is the apex AML body, which expects each country to have, starting with a national risk assessment and going downstreaming to each FI having its own risk assessment process for AML and CFT. Next slide, please. Okay, the next slide is about the conclusion on the impact of non-compliance. And this is something that all of us know, that if we don't comply, what could be the implication? There have been penalties, and AML has been the most common of these violations that's been identified by the regulators, and while penalizing the banks and FIs. There are reputational risks involved. If we do not correctly identify and measure our risks on AML CFT, and we have seen that in the 1MDB scandal, the FinCEN file leaks. There are legal costs which are prohibitive, and therefore it's important that we start giving proper attention to this very, very important area of AML CFT, which has so far not been at the focus, if I may say so, and make it as a starting point of our AML program. Because as Shirish also mentioned in the beginning, when we can measure something, we can manage it. So the first step to managing the AML risk should be to measure it. And that is something which AML EWRA helps us do with proper tools, proper risk factors, and proper assessment and ongoing periodic review of those control that we have in place. So with this, I have come to the conclusion of my presentation. I will wait for your questions after the second presentation takes place, and we'll be happy to answer it. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Madhu. Thank you so much for that presentation. We have received some questions for you, which we will take after Steve's presentation. Okay. Before we start Steve's presentation, can we have a quick audience poll? Arpita, if you can run that. So when did your organization last conduct an enterprise-wide risk assessment for AML CFT? That's the question. All right, so I think the poll is done. So here are the results of the poll. I'm not sure if everyone can see it. Yes, I think everyone can see it. Interesting. All right. Let me invite our next speaker, Dr. Stephen Cutler. Welcome, Steve. Welcome to the webinar.
It's good to see you. Thanks, Shirish.
Before you start, let me just say a few words about you. So, for the benefit of the audience, Dr. Stephen F. Cutler, who earned his PhD in criminology, is the Chief Enterprise Risk and Compliance Officer for Omnipay, a successful non-bank financial institution operating globally. In this role, he addresses a wide range of issues from physical, financial, and cyber aspects of the business, as well as data privacy and AML issues. He also consults with the Philippines and international government and private sector entities on technology and security matters and teaches these topics at the university and in service levels. He is a level 2 certified data privacy officer. Prior to his work with Omnipay, he was a special agent at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His career includes 5 years as head of all FBI operations in the Philippines. So, Steve, again, welcome as a speaker. I know you've attended many Fintelekt webinars in the past, and it's great to have you on as a speaker.
Well, I appreciate. Okay, there we go. All right, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today, Shirish. It's very, very good to be here and listening to Madhu. Madhu, I appreciate the opportunity to listen to you today as well. We'll actually talk about some of the issues, I think, on at least a couple of questions as I go through my process here. So we're going to be talking a little bit about these questions today. Who does it? What do we do? Why? And so on. But one of the things that I want to strike at is many of us are very good technically, but there are a couple of other issues that I think we often will overlook. And we're going to be talking about that as I weave it into the answers to these questions. So the first and most fundamental question that we have to ask when we do an enterprise-wide risk assessment is, what is a risk? Well, a risk is when something might happen, a hazard might happen. From an anti-money laundering, terrorism financing perspective, the hazard isn't a chemical spill, isn't an electrical short, working from ladders that may fall over or whatever. It's that somebody has corrupted one of our employees and they're getting money through our system. Perhaps our controls are not as effective as they should be. There are politically exposed people who are getting money laundered through from corruption and so on, drug dealers and so on. I kind of give that litany of issues because it shows how wide-ranging our work as a compliance officer must be. And as I go through the rest of my presentation, you'll see a little bit about this. So then the risk that we're talking about is, what are the assessments? How do we, I'll use the word feel, but it isn't always a qualitative feeling about something. We can actually quantify things, which we'll talk about. But what is the chance that, whether high, low, or medium, that one of these hazards may actually take place? And what is the possibility of them happening? And then balance that with what's the problem? If it's almost nothing, not even a, as they call it in the military terms, not even a blip on the radar, then we don't really worry about it too much. But if it's devastating, say, for example, Madhu mentioned a few minutes ago about the FinCEN files or the Panama Papers from a few years ago. Those were absolutely devastating to the groups involved. But they didn't catch the fact that those papers might get out into the general public. And frankly, it really surprises me for FinCEN until we start realizing that a few months ago, things like the solar, wind, and so on came up, where just massively devastating data leaks to the United States federal government system. Absolutely amazing. A couple thousand years ago, there was a philosopher general named Sun Tzu. And my paraphrase of this is kind of gives us the role of what an enterprise risk assessment does. He says, if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. He goes on to say, which I don't have on a slide, if you don't know yourself and don't know your enemy, you will lose. And he's very, very certain about this. In this particular quote, you need not fear the results of 100 battles. That's because you've done a good job of knowing how you could be attacked. You've done a good job of knowing how you're protecting yourself. And I've got a couple of more quotes, or a couple of additional quotes here that broaden that a little bit. But I think it's important to set the tone for what you're trying to do and the seriousness of this. Madhu and I were speaking a little bit before the seminar, and it's refreshing for me to see that there are, several hundred of us, compliance officers and people who care about compliance, that are on this broadcast today. And I am pleased with that, because one of the things that I've noticed in the compliance field is that it's easy for me to get the feeling nobody cares and I'm on my own. And that's not the truth. As we can see from this presentation, there's around 400 of us that are online right now. Several hundred of us will watch this later. That's a really nice team to be a part of and to participate in this process today. So that's how we'll learn, by working together and helping each other out. Sun Tzu also says that it is a doctrine of war not to assume that the enemy will not come, but rather to rely on one's readiness to meet him. Not to presume that he's not going to attack us, but rather to make ourselves invincible. A lot of the things that Madhu talked about, and she mentioned earlier about FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, AUSTRAC, and the RBI. These organizations put out a lot of documents every year on ways that they've seen our enterprises coming under attack. We have to assume that we will be hit, that somebody will try to attack us and launder money through our facilities, have terrorism financing that will be processed through our facilities. And there are a lot of risks out there. When Madhu mentioned, and it's a term we're all familiar with, topologies. It's an ongoing process. Virtually every day, a new or a twist to a topology is broadcast. By getting onto email lists or checking blogs for people who are authoritative in the money laundering area, as well as to, for example, the RBI and so on, checking their websites to see if they have new postings and so on. Those are things that we must do virtually every day to learn more about how we're going to be attacked. And then we must incorporate that into the ongoing enterprise risk assessments. I was heartened to see that the vast majority, presuming everybody was honest, on the poll, that almost everybody had either an ongoing enterprise-wide risk assessment or had had one in the last few months, certainly within the last year. I will suggest that if you haven't had one of those, COVID and the lockdowns, work from home situations and so on have thrown a lot of what they call wrenches into the machine. We've got a lot of adapting that we need to do right now, and our enterprises find new ways of being at risk. That's kind of a funny way to think about it. Our enterprises find new ways at risk. And it's up to us to find new ways to protect it. And this is where the role of a risk assessment, especially on the enterprise scale, comes into play. Sun Tzu tells us that those who are victorious plan effectively. And notice what he says here, and change decisively. They are like a great river that maintains its course, but adjusts its flow. Madhu mentioned quite often, thank goodness, that what you do must be documented. And I think that's a really, really important idea, because that's part of this planning process that Sun Tzu talks about. And then it justifies why we're going to change. Boards of directors often are very comfortable with the way we've done business for years. It's worked well, and they're not really willing to change. Madhu mentioned about having to get budgets and resources. Well, if we get these budgets, a lot of times it's a zero-sum game. If you want resources to do something, we have to take it from somebody else. And they may not be willing to do that. You must be able to identify and document why you want to do what you're doing, what the benefit is going to be, and why that outweighs the costs. I think this is among the last of my quotes for Sun Tzu, but it's incredibly important also. He lists 6 ways of courting defeat, or playing with fire, so to speak. A neglect to estimate the enemy's strength, a want of authority, defective training, unjustifiable anger, and we're going to bring that up again in a few minutes, non-observance of discipline, and failure to use picked men. Now, in his days, men were always the warriors and so on. These days, I don't want to change what Sun Tzu said, but understand that term men is, in this case, non-gender specific. Everyone who works with, for, or near you is one of your picked warriors, and their talents must be brought to bear in some way. But notice this neglect to estimate the enemy's strength. How do they attack? How can they attack your products? Will they? Well, if you're a small entity in a rural area, perhaps not. But I've also seen small entities in rural areas be some very, very large scale laundering operations, because the bad guys and in connivance with corrupt leadership believe that nobody will ever pay attention to them because they're out in the rural areas. It isn't just the large banks, the RBIs, the cities, and so on who are attacked. We are all attacked at some point. Defective training. Do we know what we're doing? Do the rest of our staff know? The want of authority. If we're just going through the motions, the board and senior management says, in effect, yeah, whatever, let me sign it now, please leave. I've got important things to do. We will never be effective. And I think that's one of the things that has brought about some of the massive fines we've seen in Australia and US and European banks lately, is that the boards ignored what they were told. So who does the risk assessment? Well, often it's us as the compliance, risk and compliance officers. But often then, remember, we have to have senior management involved. They should be involved in the risk assessment as well, because they have a lot of experience and they have a lot of ideas. The key is they must care. And sadly, with most of, I shouldn't say most, but many of our boards and senior managers, they've been through risk assessments before, and it's they go through the motions, a rote exercise, ROTE, and they're not serious about it. We must, as the risk and compliance or risk assessment officers, be serious about our work and really go at it with open minds. Now, I want to hit on that topic as we continue forward. Well, how do we know? This is the way a lot of times we see risk assessments are set up. You have down the left-hand side is a probability column. And for any given risk, for any product, we'll say, well, it regularly happens. It probably will happen. It occasionally happens, rarely, or frankly, it probably won't happen. And sadly, this idea of probably won't happen is where most of us had listed, if we listed it at all, something like the pandemic, the COVID. But on the top then, it's the severity. So then we have a matrix that's set up, whether it's a disaster that's going to destroy our business, it's high, medium, minimal, and there will be different types of severity, perhaps to reputation, perhaps to the existence of our company. But one of the things in the data privacy field, at least in the Philippines, is unlike the GDPR out of Europe, which has massively high fines, the Data Privacy Act in the Philippines not only has very high fines, but jail time for senior management and the board if they're shown to be basically at fault. Imagine that. If your board members know that jail time is possible, personal jail time, not just have the company say, well, whatever, pay 1,000 peso or $1,000 or several $1 million. But if they know they're going to go to jail, that adds on that risk assessment, that's a disaster. Because frankly, my board and the boards with whom I work, they're not young. They're experienced, they have nice houses, they have nice lives, and the last thing they want to do is spend the next 5 to 10 years in jail. So here are some issues with the enterprise risk assessment. Madhu did a nice job with showing some things that we're going to want to talk about. But something that we don't often talk about, but I want to in this field, is the importance, I mentioned a few minutes ago, of an open mind. We're all human. Our boards are human, our senior management is human, our employees on the line are human. We all have biases. And that's one of the really big problems that I see in doing risk assessments, especially on the enterprise-wide level, because it's so broad. We're going to be, say, for example, the anchoring bias there in the top left. People are over-reliant on the first piece of information that they hear. And this may actually come from way back here when they began to work in a financial institution and they learned how things were supposed to be done. Well, maybe that's not the best way anymore, but yet they're still anchored to that idea from 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. The world has changed. And one of the reasons why the world has changed is because of these, the smartphones that allow us to access our bank accounts globally with the touch of a button and move money around. We didn't even have that 5 years ago to any great extent. We certainly didn't have it 10 years ago. So when people learned, our staffs learned how to do business, especially retail business, 15 or 20 years ago, this is a whole new ball game of risk that they may not be ready for. Madhu did a really nice job of, I think, raising the idea of don't wait, anticipate and look forward. This is where your knowledge of FATF and other, the OSTRAC, MAS and RBI's ideas going forward are so critically important. But there's some others here. I believe that this will be available to you later. We'll touch base with Shirish after I stop talking. The blind spot bias of failing to recognize where there are weaknesses. For example, we may have done some good training in people on the front lines, but the idea of a suspicious activity report starts with the training of the people on the front line to recognize suspicious activities, and then their supervisors to say, yeah, I think that was suspicious or not suspicious, to where it gets elevated up and then eventually gets turned over to the regulator. There are a lot of issues that we have to deal with in these various biases. Risk assessments are not perfect, nor are we. And we must be able to see those ideas as we move forward. And it's a very, well, it's a daily and sometimes hourly idea of training. Amit asked a couple of questions on the Q&A talking about the main factors and how do we benchmark. Well, my suggestion is that we benchmark through participation in seminars like this. I'm not going to give you a copy of my enterprise-wide risk assessment because my products and the way I do things from a Philippine regulator perspective will be different. Banks perhaps or financial institutions in the northern part of India may answer to the same regulator, but their risks for the same product will be different than those in the southern or perhaps the coastal areas. So one of the things that I'm going to want to caution you is it's very easy to copy and paste somebody else's risk assessment. Avoid that. Use that as a learning tool, but not as your guide, because their risks are different. A bank the size of Citi in a main urban area will face much different issues than a bank in another urban area, or especially in a rural area. So the main factors that we need to keep track of in the benchmark will be through studying what is FATF, what does the APG want us to do, how do they work on their topologies, and what do we see evolving as time goes on. Risk assessments are often scientific and quantifiable, but I want to suggest that they also contain an element of art. And we are the artists. Yes, we are the scientists. We are the lab technicians, if you want to call it that, but we're also the artists, because it depends on the personnel who are putting them together who make that call. Is this, if you'll remember my little matrix, is this significant? Is this something that is likely to happen or improbable? Well, that's a judgment call. Once I assign that, now I can quantify things, but I have to use my judgment as the risk officer. we don't always see what we need to see. This is also one of the reasons why we need to get board and senior management involvement and interest in order to protect ourselves, because one of the things that we've seen in Australia, the United States, and so on, is personal liability of the risk officer who willfully did not assess a risk the right way. Our companies stand at massive risk for fines, perhaps jail time, but certainly with fines and reputations. But we're also need to take on board to us our communities and our nation. And we need to be focused and serious in taking a look at this. And we need to make sure that our boards and senior directors or senior officers are doing the same thing. Now we'll talk about questions. I see that there's 13 of them. Amit, I don't think that really answered your question. I hope I gave you some guidance, but let's go ahead and get to the questions and answers. Thank you very much. Shirish, Madhu, thank you for being on with you, and to the 400 participants, thank you all for being with us today. Thanks. Let me see if I can.
Thank you, Steve, for that fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
And yes, I agree with you. Compliance is a science and an art. We have 400 artists with us right now.
There you go. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks so much, Madhu and Steve, for being here with us today as speakers and sharing your thoughts and experiences. Thanks to the wonderful audience. Also, a big thank you again to our partners, Asian Bankers Association, especially Ernest, Amador, and Meg, for working together with Fintelekt to make this webinar and the others a success. We look forward to seeing all of you again at the next Fintelekt ABA webinar, which is on the 7th of April, where the theme is going to be the total cost of compliance. Also, I would like to announce that we have another Fintelekt webinar on modern slavery. Is your bank protected? Which Fintelekt is organizing with speakers Matt Friedman and Phoebe Ewan from the Mekong Club Hong Kong, where we will share how banks should do a baseline risk assessment to find out their institutions' risk exposure to human trafficking. I have shared the registration link in the chat window, but obviously all of you will get an email from us. With that, let me close today's webinar. Thank you so much for attending. Have a great day ahead and look forward to seeing you at the next one. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.